During the dark and autumn day, I rode on my horse just inches away from the gloomy house of Usher. I noticed the house and its many features: bleak walls, vacant eye-like windows, and white trunks of decayed trees. I thought to myself, what unnerved me so much with the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was an enigma that I couldn't solve, and I couldn't deal with the eerie fantasies that flooded over me as I pondered. Nonetheless, I offered to myself a vacation of a few weeks in this gloomy home. Roderick Usher, the proprietor, had been one of my childhood boon pals, although it had been a long time since we had seen each other. However, a letter from him had recently arrived in a faraway section of the country, and its outrageously urgent nature had demanded nothing less than a personal response. As I raised my eyes to the home, there was a vivid forest of sensations that tormented me. I had worked so hard on my imagination that I truly believed that a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued, hung around the entire mansion and domain, an atmosphere that reeked up from the decayed trees.
I rode over a little causeway to the house after noticing these objects. A valet with a stealthy foot then led me in quite through several dark and convoluted tunnels on my way to his master's workshop. Much of what I saw along the journey contributed in some unknown way to the intensification of the hazy feelings I've already expressed. While the objects around me, the ceiling's carvings, the sombre tapestries of the walls, while I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar all of this was, I still wondered how unfamiliar the fantasies which ordinary images were stirring up.
The room I was in was quite huge and lofty. The windows were tall, narrow, and pointed, and they were set so far back from the black oaken floor that they were completely unreachable from the inside. A terrible, deep, and irreversible sadness hung over and dominated everything. Usher sprang from a sofa on which he had been reclining at full length upon my arrival, and greeted me with a vibrant warmth that reminded me of an overdone cordiality. A glance at his face, on the other hand, reassured me of his complete honesty. We sat down, and for a few moments, while he didn't speak, I looked at him with a mixture of sorrow and wonder. Surely no one has ever seen a guy change so drastically in such a short time as Roderick Usher. I could only admit the identity of the man being in front of me with a buddy of my early boyhood with reluctance. His face, on the other hand, had always had a unique personality.
It was in this manner that he discussed the purpose of my visit, his sincere wish to see me, and the comfort he expected from me. He went into great detail about what he thought was the nature of his ailment. He was plagued by a morbid acuity of the senses. Even the most insipid food was tolerable. He could only wear garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. Even a faint light tortured his eyes. And there were only peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments, that did not terrify him. He then told me in this manner that the sickness he is suffering from is one of his family, and he couldn't desire more for it to be gone. Usher was fully controlled by a terrible kind of fear. I shall die, he said. I shall die. I must die of this full sickness. In this way, and no other way, I shall be lost. I fear what will happen in the future, not for what happens, but for the result of what happens. I have indeed no fear of pain, but only fear of its result, of terror. I feel that the time will soon arrive when I must lose my life and my mind and my soul together in some last battle with that horrible enemy, fear. He began thinking that when she dies, he's going to become the last member of this family. Then we saw Madeline herself pass slowly through a nearby part of the room, and without saying that I was there, went on. I looked at her and a fear fell upon me, and yet I found I could not explain to myself such feeling. My eyes followed her. When she came to a door and it closed behind her, my eyes turned to the face of her brother, but he had put his face in his hands, and I could see only the thin fingers through which his tears were flowing. Oh, how depressed my dear friend was.
The next few days, Usher and I would not even mention her name, so I attempted to relieve my friend of his sadness. Usher drew paintings that made me terrified. though I did not know the reason for this fear. One evening, Usher came up to me and gave me horrendous news. His sister was no longer alive. He stated that he would store her body in one of the several vaults within the building's walls for a period of time. I felt compelled to agree with the worldly reason presented for this. Because of the nature of her condition, the peculiar curiosity and queries of her doctors, and the enormous distance to the graveyard where members of his family were laid to rest, he had decided to do so. We were the ones who took her body to its final resting place. The vault in which we hid it was small and dark, and it must have witnessed terrible and bloody events in the past. We looked down at the dead face one last time, and I was filled with wonder. As she lay there, the Lady Madeline looked not dead, but just sleeping, still soft and warm, though to the touch cold as the stones around us. There was still a color in her face, and there seemed to be a smile on her lips. My friend suddenly changed and began hurrying his step, and his face was more white than a ghost itself, and no more liveliness in his eyes. The trembling in his voice showed great fear.
Later on, while I was trying to sleep on the night of the seventh or eighth day after we placed Lady Madeline in the vault, I started to experience the conditions Usher experiences at full power. While the hours passed, I could not sleep. A sense of dread weighed heavily on my shoulders. I changed into my clothing and began anxiously strolling about the room. I had only been walking for a few minutes when I heard a soft step approaching my door. It had to be Usher. I saw him at my door in a flash, white as usual, but with a crazy chuckle in his eyes. Despite this, I was relieved to have his company. "Have you seen it?" he inquired. He dashed to one of the windows and flung it open to let the storm in. We were practically lifted off our feet by the ferocity of the approaching wind. It was a stormy yet gorgeous night, as well as a regular one. I said to Usher, "You shall not look out at this." As I moved Usher away from the window to the seat, I said to him, "This sight that so astonishes you has been seen somewhere else. It's possible that the lake is to blame. Let's shut this window. It's freezing outside. Here's one of your favorite stories. I'll read, and you'll listen, and we'll go through this terrifying night together."
I had taken up an old book that had been written by a fool for fools to read, and was not one that Usher enjoyed. It was, however, the only one that was easily accessible. He appeared to be quietly listening. Then I got to the section of the narrative where a man, and a powerful man full of wine, starts breaking down a door, and the sound of the dry wood breaking can be heard all the way across the forest around him.
There was no way there could be any doubt. This time, I did hear a faraway sound that sounded eerily similar to the animals' cries in the story. I resumed reading and shortly reached the point in the novel where a big piece of iron lands with a ringing sound on a stone floor. These words had hardly left my lips when I heard a tremendous ringing sound from afar, as if someone heavy had dropped heavily against a stone floor, or as if an iron door had closed. I completely lost control of myself and jumped out of my chair. Usher remained seated, shifting his weight from side to side. His gaze was drawn to the ground. I dashed over to his seat. I could feel his whole body trembling as I placed my hand on his shoulder. A sickly smile crossed his lips. He talked in a slow, fast, and frightened voice as if he didn't realize I was there. He said, "Yes, I heard it. Many days I had heard it, but I did not dare to speak. My senses were strong. I heard her move many days ago, but I didn't dare to speak. They were her sounds. Where should I go? Where should I run? I hear her footsteps on the stairs. I hear the heavy beating of her heart." Here he jumped up and cried as if he were giving up his soul. "I tell you, she now stands at the door." The door opened, maybe the work of the rushing wind. Outside the door stood the gloomy, in its grave clothes, body of Lady Madeline. Blood on her dress. For a moment she stayed trembling at the door. Then, with a low cry, she fell heavily in upon her brother. In her pain, as she died at last, she carried him down with her, down to the floor. He was too dead.
I began to rushed from the room, rushed from the house. I ran and ran. The storm around me with all its might. A strong wind came rushing over me. I saw the great walls falling apart. There was a long and stormy shouting sound, and the deep black lake closed darkly over all that remained of the house of Usher.